Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into something truly bone-chilling. Home is supposed to be our safe haven, but what happens when that sense of security is ripped away? In this video, we'll explore 3 horrifying home invasion stories. True accounts that will have you double-checking your locks and peeking behind every curtain. From terrifying encounters to acts of survival that defy the odds, these stories are guaranteed to keep you on edge. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss a story that'll send chills down your spine. Now, get comfortable, if you can, and let's dive in. Story 1. The House on Dorchester Lane. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After months of searching, the Hill family had finally found the perfect house, a cozy 2-story colonial in the suburbs of Kansas City. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. For Catherine Hill, a single mother of 2 boys, it felt like the answer to a prayer. The house itself wasn't perfect. It was old, with creaky floors and a faint musty smell that lingered no matter how many windows she opened. But Catherine didn't mind. She was proud to have found a home where her boys, Alex, 12, and Charlie, 8, could finally feel safe and settled after years of upheaval. The first week in the house was uneventful. The boys loved their new rooms, and Catherine spent her evenings unpacking and making the place feel like home. But as the second week rolled around, strange things began to happen. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Catherine would hear faint tapping sounds at night, coming from somewhere in the walls. She assumed it was the house settling or maybe a rodent problem. Then things began to disappear. First, it was her favorite coffee mug, which she later found on the windowsill of the upstairs bathroom. Then a set of keys vanished, only to turn up a day later in a drawer she hadn't used yet. The boys didn't seem to notice anything unusual at first, though Alex mentioned that his bedroom felt drafty despite the summer heat. Catherine dismissed it. Old houses were bound to have quirks, she reasoned. But then one night, Charlie woke her up, shaking and pale, insisting that someone had been in his room. "He was standing in the corner," Charlie whispered, clutching his blanket. "I couldn't see his face, but he was there." Catherine hugged him, assuring him it was just a bad dream, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in her stomach. She checked his room, turning on every light, but it was empty. Still, she started locking all the doors and windows before bed, just to be safe. The next morning, Alex was unusually quiet at breakfast. When Catherine asked what was wrong, he hesitated before saying, "I think someone was walking around upstairs last night. I heard footsteps when I got up to use the bathroom." Catherine's stomach tightened. She didn't want to scare the boys, so she brushed it off, saying it was probably the old floors creaking. But that night, she stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on low, straining to hear any unusual sounds. For hours, the house was silent, until just past midnight when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the second floor. Her chest tightened as she grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs. The hallway was dark, but she could hear the faint sound of breathing, soft, shallow, just beyond the door to the boys' room. She flung the door open, her heart pounding, but the room was empty except for Alex and Charlie, fast asleep in their beds. 2 days later, Catherine decided to do a deep clean of the house, hoping to distract herself from the growing unease. She started in the basement, which was dim and unfinished, with concrete floors and exposed pipes. As she moved an old shelf away from the wall, she noticed something odd, a small, square panel, partially hidden behind a stack of old paint cans. It was a crawlspace. Catherine hesitated. She didn't remember the landlord mentioning a crawlspace, and the thought of what might be inside made her skin crawl. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver, prying the panel open. The smell hit her first, stale and earthy, like something that had been buried for a long time. The flashlight beam illuminated a narrow tunnel, just big enough for someone to crawl through. Catherine's stomach churned as the light caught on something glinting in the dark. She reached in and pulled it out. A crumpled soda can. Beside it was a candy wrapper. Her hands trembled as she realized what she was seeing. These weren't ancient relics or forgotten junk. They were fresh. Someone had been using the crawl space recently. Catherine slammed the panel shut and ran upstairs, her heart racing. She called the landlord immediately, demanding to know if anyone had access to the house. He seemed confused, insisting that no one else should have keys. But his hesitation, the nervous way he cleared his throat, told her he wasn't being completely honest. The breaking point came a week later. Catherine was lying in bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, when a loud crash jolted her awake. It came from downstairs. She grabbed her phone and rushed to the boys' room, her heart pounding. Both Alex and Charlie were wide awake, their faces pale with fear. "Stay here," she whispered, locking the door behind her as she crept down the stairs. The living room light was still on, casting long shadows across the furniture. Catherine scanned the room, her eyes landing on the back door. It was wide open, the lock dangling uselessly from the frame. Her stomach dropped as she realized someone had forced it open. She turned to grab her phone, but before she could dial, she saw him. A man stood in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, his clothes filthy and torn. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but what terrified her most was his smile, a crooked, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across his face. Catherine froze, unable to breathe. The man took a step forward, his head tilting like he was studying her. "I've been here all along," he whispered. The spell broke. Catherine turned and ran, screaming for the boys. She locked the three of them in the bathroom, clutching a pair of scissors as she called 911. The man banged on the door, laughing, the sound echoing through the small house. It felt like hours before the police arrived, their shouts finally silencing the man. When they searched the house, they found him hiding in the crawl space, surrounded by wrappers, empty cans, and a filthy sleeping bag. He had been living there for weeks, slipping out at night to wander the house while they slept. The true crime behind the story. This story is inspired by the case of Daniel LaPlante, a notorious criminal from Massachusetts. In 1986, LaPlante terrorized a family by hiding inside their walls for months, secretly watching them and moving through crawl spaces. He would rearrange objects in the house and leave cryptic messages to torment his victims. The family only discovered him after hearing noises and finding him dressed in their deceased mother's clothing, holding a hatchet. LaPlante was eventually arrested, but his story remains one of the most chilling examples of real-life home invasion and psychological terror. His case is a haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight. Now, let's continue to story 2, The Stranger in Apartment 3B. When Clara Johnson signed the lease for her new apartment, she thought her luck was finally turning around. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom on the third floor of a nondescript building in downtown Portland. But after a messy breakup and months of couch surfing, it felt like a fresh start. She moved in with just a mattress, a few boxes of clothes, and a handful of kitchen supplies. For the first time in a long time, she had her own space. The building itself was older, with creaky stairs and peeling paint in the hallways, but it was affordable and close to her new job at a local bakery. Her neighbors seemed friendly enough, especially Mrs. Rose, the elderly woman who lived across the hall. "If you ever need anything, dear, just knock," Mrs. Rose had said warmly. "This building may look rough, but we all look out for each other." Clara appreciated that. After months of chaos, the thought of a tight-knit community felt comforting. But that comfort wouldn't last long. It started on her third night in the apartment. Clara had just gotten home from a late shift at the bakery and was rinsing off in the shower when she heard it, a faint tapping sound. It wasn't the usual creak of old pipes or the hum of the building's radiator. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone tapping a fingernail against a window. She froze, her heart racing as the sound grew louder. Wrapping herself in a towel, she stepped cautiously into the living room. The tapping stopped. She glanced around, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the walls. Everything seemed normal. Convinced she was just tired, Clara locked the windows and went to bed. The next morning, as she headed out the door, she noticed something strange. A pair of dirty shoe prints trailed down the hall, starting just outside her apartment. They were faint but unmistakable, leading toward the staircase. She shrugged it off, assuming one of her neighbors had tracked in dirt. That night, however, the tapping returned. This time, it came from her bedroom window. Clara's building was 3 stories high, and her window faced a narrow alley. There was no fire escape, no balcony, nothing that anyone could climb to reach her window. And yet, as she stood there in the dark, staring at the glass, the tapping continued. Heart pounding, she yanked the curtain aside. The alley below was empty. No shadows, no movement, just the faint glow of the street lamp. She told herself it was the wind, maybe a loose branch scraping against the building. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A week later, Clara started noticing a smell in the apartment. At first, it was faint, something sour and metallic, like rusted pipes. But it grew stronger, permeating every corner of her home. She cleaned obsessively, scrubbing the floors, taking out the trash, and even checking under the sink for leaks. But the smell wouldn't go away. It seemed strongest near her closet. She opened it, her nose wrinkling as the odor hit her full force. She half expected to find a dead rodent or mold, but the closet was empty except for her neatly hung clothes and a pile of shoes. Puzzled, she sprayed some air freshener and closed the door. The next morning, Clara woke up to find the closet door ajar. She frowned, certain she had closed it the night before. The sour smell was back, even stronger this time. As she stepped closer, a chill ran down her spine. Her clothes were all hanging backward, their fronts now facing the wall. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't done that. Had she? Maybe she was sleepwalking. She'd never done that before, but she couldn't think of another explanation. She tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. Still, she couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease as she got ready for work. By the time Clara returned that evening, she had convinced herself she was overreacting. She spent the night binge-watching a TV show, trying to keep her mind off the strange occurrences. But just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, more insistent. She sat up, her chest tight with fear, as the tapping moved from the window to the closet. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound wasn't just tapping now, it was scratching, faint but deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The operator answered, and Clara whispered, "I think someone's in my apartment." The scratching stopped. "Stay on the line," the operator instructed. "Officers are on their way." Clara stood in the middle of the room, every nerve in her body screaming for her to run, but she was too afraid to move. Minutes later, there was a loud knock at the door. "Police!" a voice called. Relief flooded her as she rushed to open the door. 2 officers entered, scanning the apartment with flashlights. Clara explained what had happened, her voice shaking, and they began a thorough search. They checked the windows, the locks, the bathroom, everything. The apartment was empty. "We'll file a report," one of the officers said, though he didn't sound particularly concerned. Probably just a prank or a neighbor making noise. Clara wanted to believe them, but something about their dismissive tone bothered her. She didn't sleep that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. 2 days later, Clara decided she couldn't take it anymore. The smell had returned, stronger than ever, and her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She called her landlord, demanding that someone come inspect the apartment. The maintenance worker arrived that afternoon, a burly man named Joe, who smelled faintly of cigarettes. He listened patiently as Clara described the noises, the smell, and the strange occurrences. "Probably a dead animal stuck in the walls," he said, grabbing his tools. Joe started in the closet, shining a flashlight into the small gap at the back where the drywall didn't quite meet the floor. "There's definitely something here," he muttered, pulling out a crowbar to pry the panel loose. The moment he removed it, the smell hit them both like a wall. Clara gagged, covering her mouth, as Joe coughed and reached for his flashlight. "What the hell?" he murmured, shining the beam into the gap. At first, Clara couldn't see what he was looking at. Then Joe stepped back, his face pale, and she moved closer. Inside the wall was a small, makeshift space, barely large enough for a person to crouch in. There was a dirty sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a small pile of items Clara recognized immediately. A hairbrush, a scarf, and her missing coffee mug. Her knees buckled as the realization hit her. Someone had been living in her walls. Joe called the police immediately. When they arrived, the officers searched the crawl space and found something even more chilling: a notebook filled with crude drawings of Clara, alongside detailed notes about her daily routine. The last entry read, "She's starting to notice." The true crime behind the story. This story is inspired by the terrifying case of the Denver Spider-Man, Theodore Coneys. In 1941, Coneys broke into a home and lived undetected in the attic for months, secretly watching the homeowners and sneaking out at night to steal food. His presence was only discovered after the homeowner was murdered, and police found Coneys hiding in the attic. Just when you think the worst is over, some stories take a turn that's even more unsettling. Our final tale brings us to a seemingly quiet rural property, but lurking in the shadows is something far from peaceful. Now, Story 3. The Man in the Barn. The Man in the Barn. When the Peterson family bought the old farmhouse, it seemed like a dream come true. Nestled in the rolling countryside of Montana, the property came with 10 acres of sprawling fields, a dilapidated barn, and a stunning view of the mountains. After years of city life, Ben and Sarah Peterson wanted their 2 kids, Lily, 10, and Max, 7, to grow up with fresh air and open space. The house was charming, albeit in need of repairs. Ben spent most of his evenings patching up the roof, replacing windows, and fixing the creaky porch steps, while Sarah focused on making the interior feel like home. The kids loved exploring the fields, chasing each other through the tall grass and peeking inside the old barn, which still held remnants of its past. Rusted tools, broken fencing, and piles of hay that smelled faintly of mildew. The Petersons had no idea what they'd invited into their lives. It was a crisp autumn evening when Sarah first noticed something strange. She was sitting in the living room folding laundry when she heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from outside. She glanced out the window but saw nothing except the barn, its silhouette dark against the twilight sky. The sound came again. Scrape, scrape. It reminded her of someone dragging something heavy across wood. She told herself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat scavenging for food. The next morning, Ben found the barn door ajar. The old padlock that had been keeping it shut lay broken on the ground. He frowned, assuming it had simply rusted through, and made a mental note to replace it. And that night, as the family sat around the dinner table, Max spoke up. "I saw someone in the barn today," he said casually, chewing on a piece of bread. Ben and Sarah exchanged a glance. "What do you mean, someone?" Sarah asked. Max shrugged. "I don't know. Just a man. He was standing by the hay pile. He didn't say anything, so I left." Ben's fork clattered onto his plate. "You stay away from that barn, understand?" he said, his voice firm. Max nodded, his wide eyes showing that he understood he'd done something wrong. That night, Ben took a flashlight and his old hunting rifle and went to check the barn. He found nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. Still, he felt uneasy as he locked the barn doors with a new padlock and headed back to the house. A few nights later, Sarah was putting the kids to bed when Lily called her into the room. "Mom, I hear someone walking outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah listened, and sure enough, she heard it too. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. She peeked out the window, her heart pounding. The yard was bathed in moonlight, but it was empty. She didn't sleep that night, jumping at every creak and rustle the house made. The next morning, as she walked to the barn to feed the chickens, Sarah stopped cold. There were footprints in the dirt, large, heavy boot prints that led from the edge of the woods to the barn and back again. Her stomach turned. They hadn't had visitors in weeks, and Ben's boots didn't match the size or tread. When she told Ben, he dismissed it. "Probably just a drifter passing through," he said, though he didn't look convinced. That evening, he set up an old motion-activated floodlight outside the barn and promised Sarah they'd keep an eye out. The floodlight didn't deter whoever, or whatever, was lurking around the property. One night, just after 2 a.m., the light flicked on, illuminating the yard. Sarah woke first, nudging Ben awake. "The light's on," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Ben grabbed his rifle and crept to the window. The barn door was open. He could see the faint outline of someone standing just inside, their figure hunched and motionless. Ben's blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be there. "Stay here," he whispered to Sarah as he slipped on his boots and headed outside. The grass was damp with dew, muffling his footsteps as he approached the barn. He raised the rifle, his hands shaking, and called out, "Hey, you're on private property." The figure didn't move. Ben stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I'm armed," he warned. "Show yourself." The figure finally moved, stepping into the light. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and dirt-smudged. He wore tattered clothes that hung off his thin frame, and his eyes. They didn't look right. They were wide, unblinking, and gleamed with a strange intensity. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Ben tightened his grip on the rifle. "You've got 5 seconds to leave," he said, his voice trembling. The man smiled, an eerie, lopsided grin that didn't reach his eyes. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. Ben called the sheriff the next morning, but there wasn't much they could do. "Probably a squatter," the deputy said, though his expression darkened when Ben described the man. "We'll send someone out to take a look." For a week, things were quiet. The barn stayed locked, the floodlight didn't flicker on, and the Petersons began to relax. Then, one night, it all fell apart. Sarah woke to the sound of the floodlight snapping on and off, its beam flickering across the yard. She shook Ben awake, panic rising in her chest. As they peered out the window, they saw him, the man, standing in the middle of the yard staring directly at the house. Ben grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, but by the time he reached the yard, the man was gone. The barn door was wide open, the padlock lying in the dirt. Inside the barn, Ben found something that made his stomach lurch. There was a small makeshift bed hidden behind a pile of hay, along with empty food wrappers, a knife, and a photograph of Sarah and the kids. It had been taken from the kitchen, without their knowledge. They didn't sleep that night. At sunrise, they packed their belongings, loaded the kids into the truck, and left the farmhouse for good. The true crime behind the story. This story is inspired by the case of Carl Tanzler, a man who became infamous for his obsession with a woman he barely knew. Though Tanzler's case involved deeply disturbing post-mortem acts, this retelling draws more broadly from other instances of stalkers and squatters who invade their victims' lives in increasingly unnerving ways. There are countless true stories of people discovering strangers living in attics, basements, or barns, places meant to be safe and private. These cases remind us that real-life horrors can sometimes be closer than we think, hiding in the places we'd least expect. Thanks for watching, guys! If you enjoyed tonight's video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll never miss a new upload. We've got more spine-chilling stories and true crime content coming your way every week, so stay tuned. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.